pollen on her feet, on her hind legs, like yellow boots. There's one helper to the left and two to the right, and they all want some of her pollen. But she didn't want to give them any, so they're still hanging out near the entrance. And there she is, there's a brood cell with a cake of bee bread in it, which has been sealed with a partition. And she's preparing the bee bread cake for the next egg that's going to be laid. So she's just on the side of the partition nearest the entrance. She's already dumped her pollen. We missed the actual act, but we'll catch her on the next trip. The other bees have taken a little while to figure out where she went, but they're going to beg for some of this food. She's very busily rubbing the pollen off herself and regurgitating nectar into the food and mixing it together as if making dough for bread. Here's a movement that looks impossible. Her abdomen and legs look still, but her whole wing apparatus goes back and forth. She probably does this by she's bracing herself with her abdomen and legs and then wiggling her thorax and head so the wings go along for the ride. But she's essentially doing the bee equivalent of kneading dough. During this time, she gets the right mixture of pollen and honey. She also turns the nectar into honey and gets the right proportion of the two. She also adds chemicals from her body which kill fungi and bacteria, sort of preservatives. Much greener than some of the ones we use, I'm sure. And she also is combing the food for parasites. They're little mealworm-like beetle larvae, caterpillars, and mites that would reduce this food to a mixture of urine and pollen shells rather than honey and pollen. So for this to be a wholesome food for her baby, she must frequently chop it up and inspect it and reformulate it at this stage. The egg that she is going to lay is almost as long as she is and the bee it will become. It's extruded like toothpaste and will be shaped like a toy balloon, cylindrical and rounded at both ends. We will see the egg being laid shortly. Now, in her act of mixing the food, she gets pollen all over herself again. So she will actually groom the pollen into her pollen baskets just as she would when visiting the flowers. And we'll see her dump it onto the food just as when she first came in from the field. Some carpenter bees steal food from the nests of other carpenter bees by muscling their way into the nest and collecting pollen from a bee bread, much as if they were collecting it from a flower. Sometimes a bee will even evict all the other inhabitants of the nest and even the larvae, destroying as many as 6 offspring just to get enough food to raise 2 or 3 of her own. It's very distasteful when this happens, but it's even more distasteful to think that some humans behave in this way as well. They're the helpers hanging out near the entrance. It's at this stage that parasitic flies would love to get in and lay the eggs, or the larvae of another species of parasitic fly migrate in as little microscopic beings. The microscopic fly, which is called Xenox tigrinus, the old name is Anthrax tigrinus because of its black color. This fly comes in as the microscopic larva. It gets to be as big as the bee, and only one fly larva can survive on one bee larva. But the one that enters as an adult is a little fly, smaller than a housefly. It muscles its way in, and if in a solitary nest where the mother is alone, she comes in when the mother's out and lays about 10 eggs in the bee bread, and the larva is later killed by 10 rice grain-sized larvae. But when they're helpers in the nest, the attempts at parasitism are almost non-existent. Look, we get a little bit of vibration on the camera there. The camera sits on a rack outside the shed. The wire you see swinging there in the foreground leads to a Whisper 2000, which is there to collect the sound from the bees. There are certain sounds the bee makes when kneading the pollen or removing it from her body. High-pitched squeals which help the pollen grains come loose. Unfortunately, there's so much noise from the waterfall that that's pretty much drowned out here on this tape. I apologize for that. Remember, this is the year that the Mississippi flooded in the Midwest, and we had the big floods. And it wasn't that different here. Okay, there's a just finished bee bread, and we're going to see the mother come in from the field. There's a helper at left. And this is an hour later. The mother is coming back with another load of pollen. And we will see her, like someone kicking off yellow boots, kick it off her hind legs. These pollen-carrying apparatus on the hind legs are called scopi. One is called a scopa. I once referred to it in a poem by telling the xylocopa that something was beyond her scopa. That's sort of like telling a person something is beyond her purse, I suppose. See, the helper's gone to the entrance because she knows that the mother is coming home. They can anticipate her return quite accurately when she's still at quite some distance. This is not done by timing. She can sense it in some way. We don't know if this is electromagnetic radiation or infrasound or ultrasound, but it is probably sonic in origin. Okay, you can see the pollen on her hind legs. She's dumping the nectar first, now the pollen. You can see her kick her boot off. Uses the middle legs to do it. This is an unusual nest because the dominant female here is a diminutive individual, much smaller than her helper. Now these tunnels are not the normal cylindrical tunnels you would find in the wild. They're U-shaped in cross-section, like a letter U on its side. Now there's more nectar regurgitation. These tunnels are sort of half cylindrical and half square then, and that makes visibility into the nest much easier. Now a helper is going to come and beg for food. She uses a pinching or flicking-like motion with the front legs. And the mother is going to say, "No way, this is for the babies, not this time." These helpers are usually sisters or daughters of the mother, from the daughters from a previous year, though they can occasionally be strangers. When they are strangers, though, these bees do have nepotistic tendencies, and the helpers are more apt to try to cuckoo the nest and slip an egg in when the queen is away. And the queen is more apt to, upon discovering this, to destroy the helper's egg and replace it with her own if they're unrelated. If they're related, they don't contest this way too often. The correlation between tolerance of cuckooing and relatedness was discovered by Roland E. Stark, a German biologist who made himself famous on the study of xylocopine bees. He worked in the lab of Dan Gerling at the Society to Protect Nature at Hatziva in Israel. This is also the workplace of Hayo Veldhuis, a very famous xylocopa scientist from the Netherlands, and also Talia Hagendorn, who just got her PhD working on them. These bees were almost wiped out in Holland, in fact were extinct there for many years because of the cold weather, but have recently returned. Of course, the species found in Europe is Xylocopa violacea. It's a species, in fact, ancestral to the subgenus which occurs in the New World to which Virginica belongs. It's believed that violacea came over the Alaska land bridge during a warm spell before the Ice Age. They were then pushed down into Mexico, turned into seven species, 5 of which stayed in Mexico. And then one came up the Rockies and became Xylocopa californica as the glaciers receded, and Xylocopa virginica came up the Appalachians and occurs as far north as Toronto.